Good evening and welcome to Face the Nation. Across Sri Lanka, there is so much that's going on, so much that requires your attention, awareness and action. And amidst the urgency of these critical political and governance issues that continue to plague us on a daily basis, there are also those issues which have continued to warrant our attention quietly. Newsfirst policy is leave no one behind. 15% of the world's population live with disabilities. They face significant barriers to realizing their human rights. This includes discrimination in education, in employment, in housing, in transport, and being stripped of the right to make decisions about their own lives. Individuals with physical, mental and intellectual disabilities often remain invisible in their communities. Now today, through this discourse, we'll focus our attention on Sri Lanka's approach to disability in multiple spheres and how the state must protect the rights of persons living with disability. How must there be a paradigm shift in society from one of welfare to one of participatory inclusion, human dignity and empowerment. Today's topic of discussion is reimagining disability. Thank you for joining us. Very quickly, let me introduce our panel of guests to you. Joining us is Janit Rukmal, disability rights activist. Good evening and welcome, Janit. It's good to have you with us. We are also joined by Niluka Gunawardana, disability researcher and educator, visiting lecturer at the Kelaniya University. Good evening and welcome.
Thank you.
We are also joined by attorney at law Lasanthi Daskon, who's a visiting lecturer of the Kelaniya and Colombo Universities. Good evening.
Good evening, Sonali.
And finally, last but not least, attorney at law RMHP Gunaratna, member National Council for Persons with Disabilities. Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My first question is to Niluka. Niluka, the predominant approach to disability in Sri Lanka is one of charity. The views that are compounded by almost karmic and moralistic understandings of disability and stigmatization of persons with disability as well as their families. My question to you is, how must we then create a rights-based conversation on disability whilst mainstreaming the discourse in order to bring in the concept of inclusion as opposed to charity?
Right. Thank you so much, Sonali. That's a fantastic question. As you rightly mentioned, we have a very charity-oriented, welfare-oriented view of disability. I mean, if I asked you, have you run into a doctor, a lawyer or a teacher with disabilities in the past week? Your likely answer is no. If I say, have you run into a beggar with disabilities in the past week? You might say, yeah. Okay. This is where disability is located in our country at the moment. In terms of them being us rather, persons with disabilities, viewed through a charitable lens. And as you said, a lot of the reasoning behind that is through karmic discourse, that persons with disabilities have done something bad in their past lives and hence this is the natural justice or the karmic justice that they need to then play out in their lives. When we have an approach like that, there is no incentive for us to even think about inclusion or social justice because, you know, as far as we are concerned, this is natural justice. So it leads to this passivity, which we really have quite a bit in Sri Lankan society. The other thing it does is that when we have a charitable or charity-oriented perspective, we also then compartmentalize people. So disability becomes something about these other people, these poor beggar people kind of ideology that we have, right? As opposed to something that affects all of us. If we are to truly look at inclusion, we need to look at how disability affects all of us during our life courses. I mean, if we live long enough, all of us will at some point or another experience impairment. A lot of us have experienced illness, injury, temporary disabilities, but some form of realization that the way in which society is organized at present is not what is ideal for a diverse group of people, especially when it comes to diverse bodies and minds, right? So we really need that paradigm shift And in order to have a rights-based approach to disability, we first have to realize that this is not an individual problem. Right? It's not someone's personal tragedy. It's not some kind of pathology that we need to take you to a doctor to fix. It is a social issue. So that mindset in itself has to change from some kind of individualized issue to a social issue. Right? An issue of barriers. It can be barriers in terms of access, maybe even access to the studio, right? Barriers of communication for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, you know, barriers of how work and education is organized for persons with learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities. So rather than looking at, oh, it's this poor person's problem, when we are like, what are the socio-political barriers that are in place that prevent people from participating, right? So it's not that there are no disabled people out there. I've heard this argument, why should we make our building accessible? No disabled person comes here. And my question is, have you ever thought of the fact that people don't come here because your building is inaccessible to begin with? And similarly, transport, right? Yeah. Or even if your building is accessible, how are people with disabilities going to get to your building in the first place, right? Either public transport is quite inaccessible, or private transport mechanisms are very costly and are not within the purview of disability. And there are a lot of other intersections between disability and poverty, and in terms of gender-based discrimination, which hopefully maybe we'll be able to talk about during the program. But that paradigm shift from individual problem, from karmic, you know, karmic evil almost, right, to one of inclusion, to one of this is a socio-political issue, right, to one of participation and empowerment is what we really need if we are to even think about rights in terms of persons with disabilities.
Niluka, thank you for that fantastic introduction to this discourse. Lasanthi, I'd like to ask you a bit about, you're also an attorney at law. Sri Lanka ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. However, there has been up to date no local enabling legislation that has been enacted to reflect this. Could you take us through the initiatives that the government of Sri Lanka has taken thus far in this regard?
Yeah. Sonali, I think in terms of government initiatives, it's Mr. Gunaratna who would be the best place to answer this.
Absolutely.
But perhaps I could just give you an introduction to what the CRPD is,
right,
and what the CRPD's purpose was, so that leads into the conversation of how do we adopt that into the local frameworks. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the product of efforts by thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities across the world. There are organizations coming together, campaigning for a rights-based module, for a rights-based framework. So why? There were conventions. There was the Child Rights Convention, Women's Rights Convention, there were UN conventions enough. But then why specifically for disability? Because people realized, because the disabled people in this world realized that despite all of these conventions generally talking about rights of human beings, disability was being left out. It wasn't considered as part of the human diversity. So the basic fundamental principle of the UN Convention is to consider that disability is not something new, it's not something strange, like Niluka rightly pointed out. It is part of our diversity. We are humans. By that very fact, we are diverse, and disability is just one part of it. And people with disabilities are people who have inherent rights. By being human, they have inherent rights, and then they also are people with dignity. So the convention brought about this paradigmatic change which Niluka was talking about, and then says, look here, our rights, my right as a person with a disability to access education should not depend on your compassion, not anybody's compassion or charity. It is my right because I'm a person first. So this holistic approach, considering the diversity of disability, the intersectoral nature of disability, all of this was encompassed in the convention. And what is so interesting about the convention is that it is not only a legal instrument, it is also a developmental tool. So it is different to other UN conventions. And then it talks about how people with disabilities can be made part of the society, how they can live with dignity, how they can have access, how they can be treated as equal beings, equal parts of the society that we live in. So with that, this is how we should also look at how this could be incorporated into local legislation, how it could be built into the local framework to reflect all of this.
Thank you very much, Lasanthi. I'd like to move my attention now to Attorney at Law, Mr. R.M.H.P. Gunaratna. He's a member of the National Council for Persons with Disabilities and has for over a long period of time worked on issues surrounding this discipline. Mr. Gunaratna, I'd like to ask you, during the course of your work with regard to advocacy for persons with disabilities, would you say you are satisfied with the governmental initiatives that have been taken thus far, or what needs to be done?
So far, I am satisfied what they have done. Now, we became a signatory of this convention in 2007, March 30th, and it was ratified in 2016. Now we need it is necessary to draft, to make it, to give effect to the convention. It is necessary to draft an enabling legislation. So we have already done that, and it is now in the Department of Legal Draftment, and that will be, we hope that will be come through very soon, and we took convention is also as an example when we drafting it, and we have taken many ideas from that convention. Now the thing is, I would like to add something now. In Sri Lanka's situation is attitudes of the people should be changed, negative attitudes. And the other thing is respect for difference and acceptance of disability as a part of humanity and human diversity. Then of course we can have the equal rights and equal opportunities. Now, because now we have, I can say that there are two Supreme Court cases filed by Dr. Ajit Pereira. That is one in 2009, 221 number, and another in 2018, 273. And he also has mentioned about this legislations, enabling legislations to make the convention put into the operation and to give effect to the convention. Now we have already finished that and given to the legal department, and we did it with the support of Ministry of Foreign Affairs also. They also partners for making this, drafting this law. That's what I at present. And I must say that Mr. Dr. Ajit Pereira has mentioned about always about the accessibility. The Supreme Court judges or the cases said that this violation of this decision is a punishable offense. So therefore, people will, the only thing is create awareness about the building contractors and the departments and ministries of every ministries and district officers like that. So I think that legal issue will be coming very soon. Till then, we can use that two Supreme Court cases.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Gunaratna, for that elucidation. I move my attention now to Janit Rukmal. He's a disability rights activist. Janit, when considering the actual lived experience of disability in Sri Lanka, you're an individual who you've overcome your disability, you work on issues pertaining to persons with disability in order to empower them. Take us through the challenges that you have faced, the stigma, the barriers and exclusion in a bid to draw the people's attention to what needs to be done urgently in Sri Lanka to ensure this culture of inclusion that we are trying to talk about.
Thank you, Sonali. I think this is a task that should be undertaken probably with a longer time than we have. But then again, if I go for the briefest option I have, so when I was born, for example, I was not actually a child who had a disability. And I think there are a lot of young persons and even seniors among us who can relate to this, that with various anomalies in our system, such as medical negligence or lack of access to proper medical and care facilities, people tend to acquire disabilities. And that is something that took place in my case when I was just 17 days. And I didn't know, I didn't see the world for what it is ever since, if not for my parents' attempt of recovering the eyesight I should have had. So this is just my case, but if we were to look at the broader picture as a person with a disability when growing up, what are the challenges that we come across? I mean, one challenge is the stigmatization and the kind of issues that come with the frustration of parents, the people around us. I mean, shying away from the stark reality that this young person growing up is having or is living with a disability. So that itself is a great hindrance or a barrier to discover the prospects and opportunities as equally as anybody else. So for example, I wanted to be an engineer when I was young, and as a very young child I had the dream of driving my own vehicle. To date, I haven't had the driver's license, specifically because of my visual impairment. But then again, these are the kind of limitations that children living with disabilities start facing. And you know, as explained by two of our panelists also, poverty and all these other socio-economic factors also intertwine with this extra with this aspect of disability. And most of the time, from the very beginning itself, a child with a disability is considered a burden in the family. And it's very rarely that parents sometimes decide to have their own child just one child with a disability. In any case, when we have these all factors intertwining together, it really creates a bleak environment. So inclusive education was probably the key that opened many doors, including myself. But there are, of course, others. If you look at the statistics, there will be 34% of the persons living with disabilities who have not had the access to education. And then filtering on, those who have had the access to education are sort of left out at some point when it comes to equal opportunity employment. Because in Sri Lanka, I think we still have just a circular that sort of sets out at least a 3% of a allowance should be given in government institutions to recruit persons with disabilities, and even that does not happen in most of the institutions. And for corporate sectors, there are no standards whatsoever to recruit persons with disabilities, let alone to provide access for customers or clients with disabilities to access their services. So this is the bleak environment in which we live in Sri Lanka, as all these other countries, including our neighboring country India, is progressing with their own rights bill that empowers the persons with disabilities to access many services and a lot of advancements. I think Sri Lanka is still on its way to acquire this, just as it's still on its way for comprehensive development.
Thank you very much, Janit Rukmal, for your perspectives. I'd now like to open the floor for questions from our panel of journalists. We are joined by Shehan Ranatunga, Pavani Hapuarachi for joining us for the first time, and also Deshan Gonavala. Thank you so much for joining us. Shehan, let's start off with you.
Thank you, Sonali. If I can pose my first question to Niluka Gunawardana. Let's start off with, okay, now statistics according to the census population and housing statistics from 2012. 8.7% are differently abled or disabled. That's 1.6 million. My first question is this term, disabled, differently abled. Could you help us understand? Could you define what disabled means, and is that the correct term, if at all?
Right. Thank you for that question. I think it's quite complex, you know, in terms of terminology. Let's look at the two terms you use: disabled people, differently abled people, and also persons with disabilities.
Yes.
So if you look at, let's say, since we're looking at rights specifically, if you're looking at a person-first approach, right? Our focus first is on the rights of all people, irrespective of what their identity is, whether they are disabled, whether they are a man or woman, whether they are gay or straight, for example. Then we often resort to this person-first language. So person with disability, so that disability is seen as an aspect of one's identity. But it's very interesting, just as with other social movements, for example, the word gay, right, was very derogatory in terms of how it has been used in the past. But the term has been reclaimed by persons within the community. So I do often say disabled people, and people are like, why do you say disabled people? And you know, I used to struggle with that myself when I was like about 13. That's when you start thinking about the world and, you know, why do I call myself this and that? I can remember going to my mother and saying, Ammi, why do people say disabled people? It's like disqualified from a match or something. It doesn't mean that we are like disqualified in life. Right? So that is the perception I used to have. But I think as I grew up, you know, as I was exposed to different ideas, what I saw was disability is often seen as an extra component if we see as that word disable as something shameful, right? Something that is associated with stigma, with a lack of worth, you know. So we would shy away and say, oh, I'm not a disabled person, right? But if you say no, if you, like the other panelists have mentioned, if you view disability in terms of human diversity, in terms of the uniqueness of your experiences, and now we even have like globally disability art, disability culture, you know, even deaf culture. So there's a lot of socio-cultural flourishing that also has happened over time. But so when we use that disability as, yes, I affirm that about myself, right? Then I say I am a disabled person. So that is where it kind of comes from, right? With persons, I mean, I'm sure the other panelists also might have their own opinions on, you know, what is suitable, what is not. I'm not like hung up on terminology, honestly, right? And especially when we look at the CRPD and how much of an effect the disability movement, the global disability movement has had in this trajectory, the whole identity of the disabled person has been quite significant. And very briefly to mention, there's that when we look at disability, there are different models, right? One is like a charity model, what we have here in Sri Lanka, very individualized. Then we have the social model, which is where we look at disability not as an individual issue, but as a socio-cultural barrier-oriented issue, right? So again, the term disabled people also came through that as a collective of people who face different obstacles by virtue of their impairment or variation in their kind of embodied status, right? So I mean, like we could really go very deep into this, but I know we don't have the time, but this is kind of the reasoning behind the existence of different terminologies.
If I could pose my next question to Ms. Lasanthi Daskon. A study in 2016 showed that of 88,740 children with disabilities, that's between the ages of 5 to 19, 34% have not received any form of education. What is the status of education in Sri Lanka for children, students with disabilities? Are we built to handle this? Do we have what it takes?
Well, to give a very straightforward answer to your question, have we got it? We haven't. So, like you say, majority of the children with disabilities are left out of education. We are very proud of our universal primary education and our high literacy levels. But access to education is, again, it's a complex issue. I'm not saying it's simple. None of the representatives of the disability movement say it's simple, because it again depends on the individual needs of a student. And in an education system like ours, where we are target driven, for example, the grade 5 scholarship, it is very difficult to fit in a student with disability and provide that student the accommodations that is required, probably an assistant teacher, probably explanations in simple language. So it's things like that, it is very difficult to fit into this system of education, A. And then the next problem is that access. Are our schools accessible? Can a student using a wheelchair access a school? Simple as that. And then, is society receptive? Do the principals enroll students with disabilities into schools? I have heard enough of stories of parents where they take the child to the school and the principal refuses to admit the child to the school. Simply, it is very, so the explanation could be, our school doesn't have enough facilities for your child, so, it would be unfair for him to be in the school, something like that. Are the teachers prepared? Are other parents prepared to have a student with a disability in the classroom? Because there are complaints. They say that so I may use this word, quote unquote, normal child will adapt the behaviors of the disabled child. So this is one of the fears expressed by parents of non-disabled children. So it's very complex. It's not just access, it's not just the target-driven education system. It's a complexity of factors that keep children with disabilities away from school. And it is not only the school. Can the student come to the school? Is there access? Are the buses accessible? Can they afford it? Can the parents afford to provide assistance to a child in the school and also earn a living? Say when you go to the rural areas, most of the people, when they're daily wage earners, then how can they leave that job and come and provide assistance to their child in the school? And how are they going to support their income? So it's very complex. And then again, to answer your question, no, we are not doing enough to give access to children with disabilities to education, but it is also not simple. It has to be a reform. It has to be a reform in the education system. It has to be a reform in the way we look at disability, the way we respond to disability.
If I may ask one more question, what does a parent do in that situation? If they approach a school and the principal, for example, says, because your child is so and so, and they turn them down, where do they turn to?
So it's very interesting. So I have spoken to enough of parents who have gone from school to school, school to school and failed. And then if they cannot make the effort, if they do not have the resources to make the effort, they just resort to keeping the child at home. If not, then there is also the option of, here we have the special education system. So you can, it's very interesting that when you have a child with a disability, then the education system prefers to refer these children to the special education system. The special education system is a very interesting study in itself, because a special education classroom, in my opinion, I don't know if others would agree with this, is the most segregated environment in a school. If you go to a school and visit a special education room, you will realize that, because most often all students with all kinds of disabilities in one classroom, one teacher handling this. I'm not saying that we have a system. I'm not saying, seeing the negative of all of this, but I'm saying, and then in the school, I'll give you a very simple example. Teachers who are expectant mothers are asked to not go towards that classroom because it is a class of children with disabilities, and for the fear of their child being the unborn child being affected by these children who are there. So it all connects to what Niluka was talking about: karma, negative perception, stigma, and all of that. But then this again is, so this is why, like Janet said, we talk about inclusive education. This is why every child has to be included in the same system, where you have to be part of the system, where you have to have peers, and it also helps society, because if you grow up with a student with a disability, if you have friends with disabilities in your classroom, then disability just becomes normal. It's not something unusual. Then you know how to respond, how to assist, what to do, what is needed. So it's it helps. So it helps not only the children with disabilities, but I think society in general.
Yes, Pavani.
Thank you, Sonali. Just to add on to Shehan's question, is this due to the lack of a national policy on education introduced by the National Commission of Education to ensure the right to education of children with disabilities in Sri Lanka?
Yes, straightforward, yes, I would say yes. But I think the answer to that also lies in the disability legislation that we are planning to, that Mr. Gunaratna mentioned. So, and then also the fundamental rights framework, where we make the right to education a fundamental right. to every citizen. And what you're talking about, the national policy, is actually the implementation. How do we put the law into action? What do we do? And how do we, and then yes, it is important, but then it also has to take, like I mentioned, the diversity of disability into consideration, the complexity of disability into consideration, and then we have to look at an education system that looks at the diverse needs of different children with different disabilities.
That is why I say
Mr. Gunaratne, would you say that as a member of the National Council for Persons with Disabilities that fighting the good fight and looking forward to actually instituting these reforms, would you say it's become easier and the environment being made more conducive, or would you say it's still pretty stagnant?
referring to me.
Deshan, if you could repeat
Yes,
the question to Mr. Gunaratne.
Yes. What I wanted to ask was, as a person, I'm sorry?
I couldn't hear you.
Right, I'll repeat myself. What I wanted to ask was, as a person who is a member of a National Council for Persons with Disabilities, would you say that your efforts in creating the right environment for people with disabilities, would you say the environment has become more conducive, or would you say it's still as stagnant as it was a while back?
Environment is always actually when we as this Lasanti mentioned, when we go to have an inclusive education, the environmental position changes. And the main problem which she couldn't mention when we are given education, we know that members of the council also, that is not our part, that is part of education NIE problem. They don't give books in time. They are not supplying with braille books and other braille equipments for the children. So they have to find their own way to make those notes and everything. And the other thing is the machines, braille machines are very expensive. The braille, one of a braille writer is 180,000 rupees. So how can a poor person afford to buy that machine? So those and earphone for the deaf children, and clutches and wheelchairs. Those are being provided by the Ministry of Social Services, but not the braille writers, braille books and other educational devices. So those are very expensive. We have to import them from other countries. We don't produce them here in Sri Lanka. That's also another problem. So those are the main problems, and still our many, I can say that there are only few braille machines in Sri Lanka, maybe 100 or 150, and but children in the school, there are special schools for the deaf and blind children, and 13 schools, they are also have these problems, and especially the children who attend the inclusive education also face this problem. That is a very, so the environment can't change without having those facilities for the children.
Absolutely. Mr. Janit Rukmal, I want to pose a similar question to you. In your work as an activist in particular, have you seen any sort of encouragement in terms of the willingness to change, at least, or the willingness to institute change to make it more accommodating for people with disabilities?
Yes, well, willingness is always there, but having the willingness alone is not going to work. So as Mr. Gunaratne and Ms. Lasanti pointed out clearly, there need to be equipment. But I mean, when we talk about this issue, particularly in that light of things, maybe our viewers and all of you would think, okay, this is very expensive. Being inclusive is expensive, and the best option probably a country like ours, which is still developing, has is to move on having kept them at the welfare state. But I tell you, it's not the case, because Mr. Gunaratna here is a living example of wading through all of that. And I'm humbled to say that I have been able to make through most of those difficulties, regardless of what you call the social status and various factors that factor into this. And still, there are people who have made it through. And that itself is testimony to the fact that change can happen. But it needs tweaking. It needs few innovative adjustments. Say, for example, I can say, speaking for the academic institutions in particular, I would like to narrate a small experience that I went through while I was schooling and entering the higher education spectrum. So when I was schooling, one main issue I faced was having access to Braille teachers who could maybe read Tamil. I mean, when it comes to Braille, it's not, as many people see, it's not a language, it's a medium. It has all the languages that people can write in Braille, and it can be translated or interpreted into the respective language. So in Sri Lanka, many of the integrated teachers in the inclusive education system are aware of Sinhalese and sometimes English Braille. And when it comes to English Braille also, there are very few people who are pretty much versed in what you call these contractions, which are to shorten and make the Braille writing process efficient. So when we are mainstreaming this disability inclusion into the education field, creative interventions should be there, because the more we try to distance the persons with disabilities from the ways of the society by using mediums like Braille and even sign language perhaps, it's relatively more difficult to see the social and I mean these cultural paradigms changing into accept and to be receptive to inclusion. So we have to look at things that can bridge these gaps. For example, in our university, I'm a graduate of University of Sri Jayawardenepura, and once I graduated, I got an opportunity to help an undergraduate who was developing, who wanted to develop a system that assists the persons with disabilities, particularly people with visual impairments. So what I suggested to that person was to create a system that can scan Braille documents and translate it into local languages. And at the end, it materialized in the form of a software with the intervention of Sri Lanka Army. But still we don't see that in our mainstream system. There's a disconnect. The institutions working towards these initiatives are not collaborating, and there's no proper framework for them to work collaboratively and be more effective. And if that happens through the Disability Rights Bill or any legislation that is passed through, without working in silos, if we can unite our efforts, it's going to be possible.
Mr. Gunaratna, you mentioned the disability, or we spoke about the Disability Rights Bill, and you were talking about how there's a need for this enabling legislation to come to pass quickly. But what has been the delay, in your opinion, Mr. Gunaratna? If you take into context what's happening right now.
You are referring to the legislation?
Yes.
Yes. Because it takes little time. There are many organizations of the disabled people, blind organizations, deaf organizations, and physical handicapped people's organizations. They all want to discuss all things from the beginning. When we finish that and send it to the ministry, then sometimes they want to give their ideas again. That is part of our disabled people's problem, I think. Now this minister is an energetic man, and he says that he won't he says that he doesn't want to delay these things and must get them hurried and do it very soon. Now I think it will happen very soon.
Thank you, Mr. Gunarathan. The reason I asked the question is because in these COVID times, it seems that the world is in a big hurry.
Actually, it was passed 3 times by the legal draftsman and went to the Attorney General's department also. Even though our people were against, then they wanted to include their own ideas also. That was, it takes time.
Yes.
All right, so on that hopeful note, we're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back. You're watching Face the Nation.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. නිතරම හොඳින් සබන් යොදා දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජනාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සැම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න. We're stronger together.
Sri Lanka's premier prime-time daily current affairs program.
This is Newsline Live. Watch us for all the action. We ask all the questions that you want answers to.
Newsline Live with Faraz Shaukat Ali on weekdays at 8:30 p.m. on TV1.
එදිනදා ජීවිතයට බලපෑම් කරන පුවත් වඩාත් සවිස්තරාත්මකව ගෙනේවට පිටු අතර අපි හැම විටම උත්සාහ කළා.
සිංහල, දමිළ, ඉංග්‍රීසි යන භාෂා ත්‍රිත්වයෙන්ම පුවත්පත්වල විස්තර අපි ඔබ වෙත ගෙනෙනවා.
පුවතකට අදාළ පාර්ශවයන් සජීවීව සම්බන්ධ කරගනිමින් අපි හැම විටම සවිස්තරාත්මකව පුවත් ඉදිරිපත් කළා.
දේශීය පුවත්පත්වල තොරතුරු වගේම The Guardian, The Straits Times, Hindustan Times වැනි ජාත්‍යන්තර පුවත්පත්වල තොරතුරුත් අපි ඔබ හමුවේ ඉදිරිපත් කළා.
එලෙසින්ම ඉදිරියටත්
සඳුදා සිට සිරිසුරාදා දක්වා
උදෑසන 6:45ට අපි එනවා පිටු අතර සමගින්.
Programs that speak to your mind.
At the end of 14 days,
want the people on the government, the Council on Foreign Affairs.
Programs that make you think.
Then nothing will change.
So if I go back to my part.
Questions, answers.
you served there.
I served there for 3 years and I'm very proud to have served.
The
government is doing something.
No, because our argument is very steadfast.
Problems, solutions. TV1 is knowledge.
වටක් විදිහට මේ වෙලාවේ අපි කරන්න හොඳ දේවල් මොනවද?
ප්‍රතිශතයන් තියෙන විදිහට කාන්තාවන් ඉහළින් ඉන්නවා.
සීතල වැස්ස වගේ මුණුසුම අවුවත් ඉතාමත් වැදගත්.
But several injured animals were found.
TV1.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We're discussing disability rights, mainstreaming the discourse. We have a very interesting panel of guests with us here this evening. My first question in this round is to Lasanthi Daskon. She's an attorney at law and also a visiting lecturer at the Kelaniya and Colombo universities. Lasanthi, usually in Sri Lanka, we're used to seeing a lot of committees and commissions appointed as soon as there's an issue, whether it is in the political sphere or otherwise. How is it that the rights of disabled persons or persons living with disability, how is it that these issues are not prioritized by successive governments? And what must we now do? Because we need to be progressive, we need to be hopeful. What needs to be done urgently? Can we get together all the stakeholders, the ministry, the intellectuals, the academics, the private sector, and other groups, lawyers, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and can we form a committee or a commission and have a set of recommendations and then implement it? What can be done? What can we do?
Yeah, interesting, Sonali. What you say would be the ideal, but to be honest, yes, there are, like you said, there are commissions and committees. And for example, I mean, this is again, most of the things that we talk about here are coming also from our personal experiences. So, say for example, the National Human Rights Commission. Why can't the Human Rights Commission make disability a part of their mandate? Well, you'll be surprised at the complexity of the answer that you would get. Because for years, this is something that we have been advocating for, that we have been trying to do. But then the mandate of the Human Rights Commission is limited to include disability. They did have discussions, they did have consultations, and this was part of partially considered, if I may say, but to make this a part of their mandate and work on disability rights as part of the human rights framework of Sri Lanka, it's very complex. So the answer would be no, the Human Rights Commission does not have the mandate to work on disability. I have gone to the National Child Protection Authority and have spoken about the issues that are faced by children living with disabilities, the abuse, the discrimination. And then the answer is the National Child Protection Authority does not have a specific mandate for children with disabilities. So this is why also, Sonali, this is why it goes back to what I said earlier. This is why a convention on the rights of people with disabilities was needed. This is why a disability rights law is needed, and as the convention says in its Article 33, mechanisms are needed. So we have to have an implementation mechanism. It's not enough that a state ratifies the convention. It's not enough that the state has a law, but how do you implement the law? Because like I said, it's also a human rights as well as a developmental issue. So then you have to have a framework for the implementation. So for as far as I know, because I was also part of these earlier consultative processes to draft the law, I know that a framework, a national committee or a commission was proposed, but in the new draft, which we haven't seen, I don't know what the framework is, but yes, a framework is needed. And like you say, it needs to represent a lot of people, but primarily people with disabilities. So the global slogan of people with disabilities is nothing about us without us. So if we are having a commission, if you are having a framework, the majority, the supermajority has to be people with disabilities, and it has to be cross-disability representative. So like Mr. Gunaratne said, interests of different disability groups are different. So it is very important for each of these to be taken into consideration if we are going to make it inclusive. So my hope is that the new legal framework will would have thought of all of these things when they were finally drafting it.
Okay, fantastic. Mr. Gunaratna, currently the Ministry of Social Security, that is the ministry under which persons with disabilities comes under the purview of. The subject minister is Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and the state minister is Mr. Shehan Semasinghe. I'd like to ask you, in terms of what the ministry can do at this juncture, do you have a set of requirements which are urgent in nature? As someone who has worked in this area for so many years.
Actually, ministry has done a lot for the benefit of the disabled persons at present. Many poor and unemployed disabled persons are given 5,000 rupees allowance a month, and some people are given samuddi and some other, and medical assistance is given to them, and housing assistance 250,000 rupees will be given to make a house, to build a house, and spectacles given free, wheelchairs given free, and crutches, walkers are given free to assist the disabled people at present. That is what they are doing at present.
Mr. Gunaratna, earlier answering one of our previous questions, you said that there are only about 100 to 150 braille machines in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
What approximately what's the requirement?
Approximately the requirement is thousands, maybe thousands, because that depends on the children who are educated in schools and universities.
Right. Is there a mechanism, Mr. Gunaratna, whereby Janit said that we're working in silos, we tend to work in silos, and we need to work together in this respect specifically. Mr. Gunaratna, I'd like to ask you, is there a mechanism through which people with disabilities or a group or several groups representing persons with disabilities could go to the ministry, the policymakers, and request them for XYZ requirements?
Actually, there is a organization called Disability Organizations Joint Front.
Right.
There are about 30 organizations, consisting of 30 organizations. So they make their representatives to the ministers and ministries. They go and they advocate sometimes that even though it is not strong enough, I think.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much. Niluka, let's talk about the need for inclusive education in Sri Lanka. Parents with, we discussed initially that parents with children with disabilities face a great deal of stigma and issues when putting their children to school, to first primary school and then school and then finally university. Where do we go to resolve these issues, and what kind of measures must we take in terms of other countries? I mean, what are the international best practices that are used? Surely there, I mean, it's not rocket science. There must be simple, comprehensive ways of going about this. What are we doing wrong? Where are we going wrong?
Okay, I think actually that's a very good question, and I think Lasanti kind of touched upon it earlier in our first round. The conceptualization of what is inclusive education, but what we often get in our school systems is segregated education. So we have schools which have a special class for children with disabilities, but they are not integrated into the overall framework of the lessons that are offered, of the school culture, right? Even when we talk about universities, right now there is this effort to make our universities more inclusive as well, because it's not just about people going to class or attending a lecture. It's about your ability to participate in the socio-cultural life of that place, you know, recreational places where the, you know, university kids hang out. Okay, all those things come into the picture when you look at inclusive education, right? So it's really a cultural shift that we require in terms of how we view inclusion. And inclusion, so it's not the same as sameness, right? We don't say, okay, just put all the kids in one class, let's all, you know, just teach them the same lesson and that's inclusive education or that's equal education. No, there's an equity factor here, right? There is the need for reasonable accommodations, which is something that we really struggle with when it comes to inclusive education, inclusive employment. A lot of areas, the whole concept of how can we reasonably accommodate a student or a worker in such a way that they can participate on an equal basis with others. So this might be that they need, you know, access to a braille machine, that they, you know, need access to a sign language interpreter. So we are not saying that all kids have to be treated the same way, but they are entitled to that education and they're entitled to the outcome of then being a literate, educated person, you know. So that's where I think the systemic change needs to come into place, especially in relation to what kind of reasonable accommodations can we provide in mainstream education in order to make that inclusive to a much wider range of students than we currently cater to.
All right, thank you very much, Niluka. I move my attention now to Janit Rukmal, who's a disability rights activist. Janit, can you take us through the role of DPOs and how they can be more empowered in Sri Lanka?
Well, the role that is expected to be performed by an organization working with or for the persons with disabilities is rather facilitatory, interventionary and advocacy based. So first and foremost, as Ms. Lasanti and Ms. Niluka pointed out very correctly, the slogan that is very popular in the discourse of disability inclusion is nothing about us without us. So giving meaning to that is one of the primary needs that should be addressed by DPOs, or in modern context we call them OPWDs, as organization with and for the persons with disabilities. So in all these organizations, you might have seen in many other movements that run in parallel, such as women's rights, the rights of the indigenous persons and things like that, there have been representation which is sometimes adequate and sometimes inadequate. In the case of persons with disabilities, the traditional view is that persons with disabilities have not succeeded in having their voice on the table. And so there are a lot of people who have come forward to advocate for them, with them, and so in support of them. So, so going beyond that, it's important to empower and build the capacities of the persons with disabilities themselves, because the persons with disabilities themselves should be made aware of their rights, their entitlements, and what they can do, how they can be of service to the society, and how they can be a part of this society more effectively. That's what we call in the UNCRPD and all the UN documents pertaining to human rights as full and effective participation of persons. So that is the key point where I highlight as the role of DPOs. And next, these DPOs are organized structures and bodies which can really promote this factor of diversity. So they can partner with corporates or even whichever organizations that have the capacity of employing with equal opportunities to provide opportunities for persons with disabilities, so that, I mean, without confining them to their household as solely dependent people, they can move about and be more visible in the society so that it becomes a part of society. For example, I think in Japan, with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki strikes, disability became a part of their norm, because a lot of children were born with disabilities due to the nuclear impact. So with that, they had to invent things which are disability friendly and make the society inclusive. We know Japan is a society that lives with workaholics after these setbacks, and still the persons with disabilities there enjoy a lot of freedom, independence, and even the adults, the elderly persons are benefited through the facilities developed for that. In the United States and all these countries which have effective legislature, they have all these access to systems and facilities. So the role of DPOs is to work in conjunction with the government, such as the one Mr. Gunaratna mentioned, the DOJF, Disability Organizations Joint Front, that can unite and work with the government to advocate for these people and make effective interventions to realize the true potential of persons with disabilities to the wider social fabric.
Are effective interventions being made at present, Janip?
Yeah, well, I think interventions are being made.
Are they effective enough? Because we don't hear about them.
If it was effective, obviously, as you mentioned, we could have heard about them.
Exactly.
Right? So
these are ineffective interventions that are being done, or what needs to happen to make these interventions more effective? Mr. Gunaratna.
Create awareness. We have to create awareness among the disabled people about their rights and privileges. Many of our people, most people don't know what they have, what their rights are. So therefore, they should be made aware of these laws and legislation. There are enough legislations actually, but they don't come forward when their rights are violated. So that is one thing, because they are not aware of their rights. That should be made or create awareness among them about their rights and privileges and how to obtain those rights and privileges from the government and the other stakeholders.
Thank you.
Unawareness is the main problem, I think.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Gunaratna. Lasanthi, I'd also like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So effective intervention is very interesting, Sonali, because say for disabled people's organizations in Sri Lanka, it is challenging because they are also going against, they are also encountering barriers personally as well as institutionally as organizations, financial barriers, it could be, infrastructural barriers. But so they have, I'm saying the disabled people's movement in Sri Lanka has made effective interventions, but then it's not only the DPOs, but all of us as society. Say,
Absolutely.
for example, media has a huge role to play. So what you are doing is the result of an effective intervention by people represented by disabled people's organizations. But then it is not always the case. I mean, for simple examples, like I have a very simple example of how the media is not sensitive to this. Say, for example, during election times, one of the things that the Election Commission does is to hire a sign language interpreter for their press briefings. So the sign language interpreter stands beside the three commission members, the former commission, and interprets. But what does the media do, the visual media, electronic visual media do? They take the three commissioners but cut off the sign language interpreter,
right,
because maybe it's not aesthetically right, maybe that. So, and then the entire purpose of that is lost.
Right.
And the entire purpose of not only communicating to people with disabilities, to the deaf community, the messages is lost, but also sensitizing the entire country.
Absolutely.
In the need for sign language interpretation is lost. So it's both sides. It's not only the DPOs, they are making a lot of effort, maybe not enough. I personally say this to disabled people's organizations and say, you know, you're not doing enough. I mean, it may not be fair, but because I'm also part of the entire movement, I can say this. But then it is also the rest of the society.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for your perspectives and thoughts. Pavani, would you like to ask the next question?
Thank you, Sonali. My question is to Ms. Niluka Gunawardena. One of the main aspects where physically challenged individuals face major discrimination in Sri Lanka is with regard to the public transport sector. We see that the National Transport Commission or the Registrar of Motor Vehicles have failed to prepare a specific set of guidelines to regulate these public transport modes so that it's barrier free for the physically disabled people. How do you suggest we address this issue?
Okay, it's a great question. I think like with anything, when we conceptualize a space or a service, right, it could be our education, it could be transport, whom do we have in mind as our primary user, right? Who is the normal student, the normal pedestrian, who is the normal person who travels by bus? More often than not, we exclude persons with disabilities from our understanding of whom we think is the user, right? That's one major issue. The other major issue is that, okay, that is not an excuse, firstly, right? Secondly, I'll tell you an example. So during the tsunami, right, one of the aid packages that we got from the government of Japan was a considerable number of buses that were internally well suited in terms of accessibility, right, wheelchair access. The only thing we needed to do was to kind of get the ramp system going. So we just needed to make that modification. But unfortunately, we failed to do so. Our public transportation mechanism, despite having that opportunity, failed to provide that linkage. It was like almost given to us on a platter, you know. So for in situations like that, what I'm saying is, it's firstly a lack of political will, right? Often this argument of finances is made, right? The UNCRPD is subjected to, yes, progressive realization, because you can't change societies overnight. But that kind of situation where we have it on our lap and yet do not respond, you know, in an adequate way, it really shows me a real lack of commitment. And access to public transport is such a key thing, right? Even when we look at university students, right, getting to campus, very few people are able to afford, let's say, three-wheelers or cabs on a daily basis, right? They have to rely on this, okay? Often we think that access, the issue is with the structure, right? But that getting to places, the linkage between places is something that goes missing in the equation. So we have this whole concept of a no gap access policy, which means that it's about a whole system of access where you have nodes of institutions, places, you know, maybe social gatherings, but also how do we facilitate movement between those places, right? So that's why when we look at access also, we need to have that broader no gap approach to access, which I do not see happening here in Sri Lanka.
Niluka, don't you also think that this is a result of people just being completely oblivious to the issues that are faced?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It could be so, right? Because I had an injury about 2 months ago, and I had to use a wheelchair actually for a good month. And although I work in the disability sector, although I have so many friends with disabilities, until that happened to me, until I was in that situation, this whole barrier of inaccessibility really didn't hit me. You know, so you're right. One thing is that maybe we don't think about it. We get on with our usual lives, right?
Yeah.
There's a bus, we hop on the bus, we go, and you're like, what's there to think about, right? So that's where I think in the terms of people being exposed to this diversity of needs through programs like this, through Face the Nation, is very important for people to get into other people's shoes. You know, I wish it was part of the school curriculum, you know.
Absolutely. I think that is a huge lacuna that we face, right? So the Ministry of Education also needs to get in with the times, engage in this discourse as well.
Yeah, and it ties back to your question on inclusive education. Inclusive education is not just about the kids with the disabilities.
Correct.
It's also about the kids without the disabilities. It's also about the teachers, you know. And like, for example, I went to a mainstream school. I had some teachers who were fantastic, who were like the wind beneath my wings. And there were some teachers who perpetuated the stereotype, you know, oh, you shouldn't sit, you know how when you're in primary school, you sit with a partner, right? You're paired together, the tables are together. I remember in year 2, my teacher was like, oh, I don't want to put another child next to this disabled kid. You know, you get, I don't know, maybe she thought that the other girl's arm would fall off too. You know, it's ridiculous when you speak of it, right? But these kind of ideas are there. You know, I also remember there was a teacher who was like, oh, we don't want you in the dance production because the production would look ugly, you know. So these are things, interestingly, even as an adult, when you, school is actually where you, for me at least, where you first experience social exclusion, right? I mean, when I was a very little child, I had no idea I was different, until people started treating me differently, and then you go on what basis, and you look at yourself in the mirror and go like, oh gosh, right? And I think it's about like even, and this is the broader framework of education and also social sensitization. When you have these karmic discourses of, oh, you've done something bad, right? Like the impact of constantly being told that by your teachers or by society or by, you know, monks in the temple or something, that gets to you. And you then internalize that narrative, and you start kind of, you know, really feeling like a second, no, like I'd say third-class citizen. As you know, it really degrades your humanity as well. And that's where, Sonali, education is crucial. Because if there is one place where we can look at where can we create this paradigm shift, in schools, with all kids, not just kids with disabilities, and with proper, rigorous and kind of almost enlightened teacher education.
If I can just jump on there, one of the key elements of the UN CRPD is about political participation. And just adding to what you earlier said, you said unless you're in that situation, you won't understand or even think of it. So then you would obviously agree that it's so important that policymakers are also those who have and understand this area of disability.
I mean, absolutely, right? That's where, like Lasanthi said, like Mr. Gunaratna said, you know, we need to be in that participatory process from the word go, right? I mean, you can't talk about accessible buses without people who actually need that access. You know, so you can conduct access audits, but who are the best people to tell you about what we need to change? The people who need the access themselves, right? So, I mean, it's interesting when it comes to disability, and like Lasanthi mentioned with the CRPD, it's both a human rights instrument and a development instrument. And we have what is called like this twin track approach within that. So the twin track approach basically is that we need disability specific initiatives, right, because of the existing inequities, but we also need to ensure that all other mainstream services, right, mainstream development initiatives are disability inclusive. So you can't just have all these special things for, you know, the welfare of disabled people and so on and so forth, and then think of that leading to inclusion. It can't. The problem is with that welfare mentality, right? We can't get to inclusion if the only lens through which we process disability as a society and even at a political level is through social welfare, you know, so a lot going on there.
If I could ask Lasanthi a question regarding employment. what role does the corporate sector have to play to contribute and to bring Sri Lanka out of this situation? There's a study that was done which showed that many employers were reluctant to hire those with disabilities. Do you agree with this, first of all?
Yes, I do agree with this, but I must also say that there are a few corporates who are very proactive. They have taken measures to hire people with disabilities, give opportunities to people with disabilities, a few. The question is whether some of them are doing it tokenistically, if then that becomes a problem, because we know instances where people with disabilities are hired and they are asked to either stay at home, we will pay your salary, or asked to come to work and sit and just wait, not being productive contributors to the corporation, to the entity. So this goes back to this, the fear of disability, a misunderstanding of disability, the approach of charity, and also now because this is also like maybe because of the part of the CSR, you can proudly say we have like 5 people with disabilities working in our company, right? But then they may not necessarily have the actual commitment to this. Actual commitment goes one step further. You hire a person with disability, you provide accommodations, the reasonable accommodations Niluka spoke about. It could be, just making your workspace accessible. If it's a wheelchair user, you make your workspace accessible. Provide that person to be a productive part of your organization. Contribute. Be proud. Have that person's dignity. So that person, just because he or she lives with a disability, is not just sitting there and getting a salary because he or she is disabled. And on the other hand, we have also seen where qualified people with disabilities, say graduates with disabilities, are not hired for the positions that they're qualified for, but for lower positions because they're disabled. Because, again, I think the problem is again about awareness, sensitivity, understanding what disability is. I'm not saying it's easy. I mean, for a workplace to suddenly have a person with a disability, it's not easy. It takes adaptations, it takes a commitment, it takes an understanding. But then it also needs a very open approach. You cannot tiptoe around disability. You cannot hire a person with a disability and make that person completely dependent on someone. This is done. This is done because then there's this sympathy. We can't ask him to go and fetch his own water or something. You serve. No, give that person the ability to go and get his food. Just make access. So this is what's very important. Can you see how it all connects? Because if in school, if you associated with people with disabilities and knew how to deal with them, and then it becomes a part of your normal life. And then hiring a qualified person with a disability for the job that person is qualified for, and providing the accommodations that are needed is not magic. It's not something strange. It just becomes a part of the natural process.
I think overseas they use active measures and passive measures to deal with these. So I think we've been passive so far. Is there maybe a need to use more active measures like a quota system, for example, or job protection rights, measures like this?
Sorry, we already have a sort of a quota system. There is a 3% of employment allocated in the public sector for people with disabilities. It is implemented to a certain extent, but then more needs to be done. But there is also the question of, due to the lack of access to education, how many people can make the benefit of this quota system is a question, but then there is. And like I said, the corporate sector is also making progress, but how you do it, your intentions and the way you do it, what accommodations you make are very important.
Question is directed to Mr. Gunaratna and Ms. Lasanthi. We are talking about many protests happening in prisons at the moment. So in the context of seeking justice, the UN CRPD states that countries should have special training for courts, police and prison staff. In this regard, where does Sri Lanka stand?
Should I first start?
Yes.
Okay. So access to justice. Again, we can talk about till the cows come home, as we say. So this is something. So again, are the courts accessible? Infrastructure, physical access, is it there? And then, is it sensitive to people with disabilities? So these are issues. I would say there are some accessibility improvements in the court system, but not enough. And in terms of communication, for example, say sign language interpretation. Sign language interpretation is available, but official sign language interpretation is available. But as we know, deaf sign language users are one of the most deprived communities in this country. They're left out of the education system. They're left out of a proper streamlined sign language education system. So usually they use, I'm just giving an example to make you understand the issue, breadth of the issue. So what they resort to is to develop their own signs, domestic signs. So it's limited to the family. And say a young girl child is abused in this household. This child has to come and tell the court what happened. But she has no way of communicating this because she does not know the official standard Sri Lankan sign language. And the court cannot accept any other language but the interpretation of an official sign language interpreter. So it is as complex as that. So to answer your question, the justice system is not accessible to people with disabilities. And it is, again, not only one type of disability, it's different types of different disabilities with different needs. So there's again a lot to be done.
Yes, Mr. Gunaratna, yes, could you also add on to...
Especially the people with intellectual disability, and they are not able to claim their problems, and they don't understand what they want, and they have to find a guardian or a parent to reply the problems that they have. That is another problem. And no courts, almost all the courts don't have accessible facilities. And now, and the other thing is our people, even you, are forgetting that when you are growing, you are, everyone are becoming to disability in one way. Sometimes sensory impairment, sometimes hearing impairment, sometimes short-sighted. So that's so if people forget that, and if they are know these things, they can make they can prepare early to face those problems in future.
Thank you very much. Before we're going for our final break, Janit, I'd like to pose this question to you. In terms of psychosocial care, guidance for persons with disabilities, especially children, do we have enough resources in Sri Lanka at present? Do we have enough counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists who are specialized in guiding children with disabilities, their parents and families?
Well, I think we are on the way in this regard, because for example, the University of Kelaniya, the Faculty of Medicine in Ragama, has the probably the only department on disability studies.
Right.
And they have this coordinating center for disability inclusive development, which also provides training and learning opportunities for interventionists, such as the speech therapists, starting from speech and language to counseling, and it goes beyond. And I think the stigmatized nature of all these things tend to sort of underscore this, and so that the parents and caregivers and all these people try to submerge or hide a child's potential to show the signs of an intellectual or psychosocial disability unless it is very visible. So, and also the stereotyping that our society has also prevents a person or discourages or dissuades a person from pursuing higher in this regard because of the tragic nature that has been attributed due to the karmic discourse and also the taboo associated with people with particularly the intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, because they can't effectively communicate and articulate themselves. So we have this particular terminology, specifically very demeaning and derogatory terminology that we all associate with these children. So it's very negative in terms of social perspective for this kind of disciplines to be more pronounced and support systems to evolve and progress. So if the social attitudes are going to be more progressive and realize that persons with psychosocial disabilities are also a part of this society, and even as children they could have early interventions and they should not be kept in dark rooms in the houses or something like that, and should be left to enjoy their freedom, so these support systems can flourish and we can really lead into the disability inclusive participatory society that we all envision in this panel.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Janit. We are going for a final commercial break. We'll be right back. Stay with Face the Nation.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
දැනීමට පත්වද අපි දැන් අවදි වෙන්න වෙලාව පොලියකරණයෙන් විශාල ධනයක් ලෝකෙට ලැබුණා. දැන් අපේ කණ්ඩායමක් කියනවා අපි සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම දේශීය ආර්ථිකයෙන් යැපෙන්න පුළුවන්. සම්පූර්ණ ආදායම මේ අවුරුද්දේ බැලුවොත් එහෙම රුපියල් ට්‍රිලියනයයි බිලියන 250. අපි ගන්න ණය පොලිය පමණක් ට්‍රිලියනයි. විශ්‍රාම වැටුප රජයේ සේවකයන්ට බිලියන 200ක් විතර. ඉතින් ওই දෙක ගෙවුවම සල්ලි නෑ.
නියමාර්ථය ඉරිදා දහවල් 2:30ට බුද්ධියට අමතන නාලිකාව
කොමෙක් වන්නේ සිටිජේ කාලීන සංවාද වැඩසටහන සමග
At the end of 14 days
want the people on the government the council on foreign affairs
සිතන්න පුළඹවන නාලිකාව
then nothing will change
so if I go back to my
පොලී ගෙවීම විශේෂ ඉතාම විධිමත් සැලැස්මක්
ප්‍රශ්නවලට පිළිතුරු
you serve them.
I served there for 3 years and I'm very proud to have served there.
The government is doing something.
No, because our argument is very steadfast.
ගැටලුවලට විසඳුම්
හැම සතයක්ම විගණනයට වාචනය වෙනවා.
වටක් විදිහට මේ වෙලාවේ අපි කරන්න හොඳ දේවල් මොනවද?
ප්‍රතිශතයන් තියෙන විදිහට කාන්තාවන් ඉහළින් ඉන්නවා.
සීතල වැස්ස වගේ මුණුසුම් අවුවත් ඉතාමත් වැදගත්.
But several injured animals were found dead.
සංකීර්ණත්වය සරල කරන සත්‍යවාදී ක්‍රියාන්විතය. TV1
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We're on to our final round. My first question is to Janit Rukmal. Janit, in this disability discourse, something that is of pivotal importance is representation. Representation of persons with disability. And throughout this discourse, what we discussed is that there are lacunas, there are loopholes in the system where there is very little representation of people living with disabilities. I'd like to draw your attention specifically to representation of persons living with disability in the sphere of politics, political participation and representation. Take us through this, and this will be your final remarks.
All right. So representation is actually a broader thing, but I would like to emphasize on two specific areas of representation, which is employment in various sectors plus the political participation and inclusion in political sphere. So number one is that visibility is very important. It is of paramount importance for persons with disabilities to be mainstreamed and included in the society as gregarious social beings, just like any other human. So having this representation in every sphere of the society and of the employment sphere helps in two ways. On the one hand, it provides the kind of financial, economic and kind of backing for the persons with disabilities to be more independent in terms of finances, so that their needs are eventually met and they can advocate for themselves as a part of the labor force. So that itself is a part of representation where the persons with disabilities can be inculcated to different spheres. For example, I work in the sphere of linguistics, translations, interpretations and things like that. So when people see me as an interpreter or a translator, so they realize, okay, this guy has the potential to translate across probably 6 languages or so, and then Mr. Gunaratna, for example, is a lawyer, and like that there are a lot of people who are engaged as professionals but with disabilities. So the more they become visible in the society, not only as blue collar people, like the people on the shop floors, the people on the domestic work such as landscaping, gardening, housekeeping, things like that. It should go up and up to white collar spheres, so that the representation becomes the key for persons with disabilities to reach their rights and entitlements as well as privileges in the society. Number two is the political participation that we highlighted. Now we have been across the board, we have been talking about the need to have effective policies. But even the developing countries like Kenya, there are people with disabilities in their parliaments who are focusing on persons with disabilities and their rights. And in our country, if you go to the parliament and ask who has disabilities, at first they would not admit to having a disability, but eventually you might find some. But which one of them is clearly advocating for the rights of persons with disabilities? This is where the persons with disabilities who really dare to identify as persons with disabilities should go. And one solid example we see in the provincial and local government sector is Mr. Senarath Attanayaka, who passed away some time back. He, in spite of his disability, people have, understood or identified him for his skill set, abilities. So this is the key thing. So he served everyone, and he specifically focused on the rights of persons with disabilities in the area, in his constituency. So that is an example that Sri Lanka itself has, which should be promoted to the higher ups. And particularly the current governments or the rulership or every member in the parliament should have no fears of letting a person with disabilities contest alongside them, because that ensures their parties or their political factions gain momentum due to having inclusion as a main part of their agenda. This is key for a future that's progressive for everyone to live.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Attorney at Law, Mr. R.M.H.P. Gunaratna. Mr. Gunaratna, a policy is as good as its implementation. In this backdrop, I'd like to ask you, can Sri Lanka only be satisfied with the hopefully soon to be passage of the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act in Sri Lanka, or is there more to be done?
I think coming legislations is not only the matter that we want. As I said in my first talk, I told that the attitudes of the peoples with disabilities and the social attitudes should be changed. And the other thing is our people need more and more education. Only there, for instance, we have more than 500 blind graduates. Almost all the graduates are teachers. They apply only for teaching jobs, and they are not worrying to do any higher studies and trying to get to another area. So that is also one thing. That is what I say. Why I say that their attitudes should be changed, and our people should be able to do their higher studies. Many people are reluctant to do so because lack of money, lack of books, and lack of other educational devices. So
if
that
I may
is why.
interject, Mr. Gunaratna, what specific measures can the Ministry of Social Security undertake at this particular juncture so as to enable this transformation?
They also must they also must understand what our needs are. First of all, they must understand our needs. Our needs means disabled person's needs. Then they have to sort out the problems what they have at present, and the way now they are treating is actually not satisfied.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunaratna. Before moving to Lasanthi, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Gunaratna, in your closing remarks, can we be, as a country, can we be hopeful of achieving eventually this attitudinal shift that you spoke of? Mr. Gunaratna, I'll repeat the question.
Yes.
Can we be hopeful, as a country, can we be hopeful that we can move towards this attitudinal shift that you spoke of?
There is nothing that cannot be done. That also actually, if we want, we can do it. If we can have hopes to improve those.
Thank you very much, Mr. R.M.H.B. Gunaratna, attorney at law, for your thoughts and perspectives. Attorney at law Lasanthi Daskon, I'd like to ask you, after almost 2 hours of this conversation, which has been so fantastic. What measures can we as a society take or be mindful of in terms of not working in silos, in terms of not just shutting our minds and eyes to the realities of issues faced by our own peoples? What can we do proactively? Because we have viewers watching this program right now wondering, okay, what can I do? What can I do to be an ally?
It's a very interesting question, Sonali. I'll try to sum my answer up as best as possible. So, I mean, it also connects to Mr. Gunaratna's answer. What can the question to Mr. Gunaratna, what can the Social Empowerment Ministry do? It's not the job of one ministry. It cannot be done. Disability is so diverse, complex. Every ministry, every department, every entity has to be involved. It is the same for society. As members of society, all of us has a duty, a responsibility to be allies, to contribute to this. And but the point I want to emphasize is that don't be a supporter of disability out of sympathy. Don't do it for charity. Do it because you believe in the rights of people with disabilities. So I must thank Janith here for mentioning my late husband, Senarath Attanayaka, who was a person living with a disability. So this is how I became an ally. This is how I joined the movement and started contributing to the movement, not out of charity. People often call me a hero, and that was an ongoing joke in our household, because there was a serious question as to whether I was a hero or I was just misusing his disability for my benefit. So this was, you know, we joked about it, because in our relationship it was equal. So what we have to, this was the success of our relationship. This was how we managed our marriage without me feeling sorry for the person with a disability whom I married. People ask me what made me marry a person with a disability. Nothing made me marry but the love. I just fell in love with a man, that's it, and we decided to get married. No, I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want to, you know, be this great woman who marries this poor disabled man. No, Senarath would be the last poor disabled man if all of you knew him. So you have to give equality, recognize people with disabilities as equal members of our society, and be allies. Don't feel sorry. And then remember, in the CRPD also, this is what it says. Disability rights is not only about people with disabilities, it is about the society. It applies to all of us. And like Mr. Gunaratna rightfully said, any one of us could become disabled at any point of our lives, and especially in old age. We are completely forgetting the huge number of the aging population in Sri Lanka. So, to sum up the answer, be an ally. Any one of us can become an ally, but don't do it because you feel sorry. Do it because you believe in the dignity and rights of people with disabilities.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks, Lasanthi. My final question is to Niluka Gunawardena, disability researcher and educator. She's also a visiting lecturer at the University of Kelaniya. Niluka, the need to support families with children with disability, especially given the intersectionality with poverty on the one hand, and also the gender intersectionality. These are two crucial issues that I'd like you to touch upon before we conclude our show tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that into the picture. Like Lasanthi mentioned, this is not a solitary journey. When we talk about persons with disabilities, the families of persons with disabilities are as important. Often in countries like ours, so if you look at the prevalence of disability, 80% of people with disabilities actually live in the global south, that means developing countries, because there's a very close interlinkage, like you mentioned, between poverty and disability, right? Due to the higher incidence of disease, malnutrition, even during pandemics like the COVID pandemic that we're getting right now, warfare, there is a higher chance of people experiencing disability, right? But they don't experience it on their own. As we have seen during the course of this panel, it's not just persons with disabilities, but often their families also who are stigmatized, who are kind of marred by that label that we have of disability. And it's often mothers in countries like Sri Lanka who are blamed. So this is where the gender aspect comes into it. And also, as a culture, we have this idea that it's a private affair. Everything is a private affair when it comes to controversial issues, right? So it's up to the parents to take care of this child, right? We don't look at our obligations as a society to support that family system. And especially if you're a low-income earning household, right? And if you have a high care need for a child in your family, can you afford for one of you, assuming that it's a couple, and let's assume that you're like a single parent, right? Can you afford to forego employment to provide full-time care? Often you can't, right? And what happens in Sri Lanka is a lot of children with disabilities then end up getting institutionalized in charity homes. And these institutions are like the residue of the colonial past. It's for me the colonial hangover of disability, right? It's based on the poor houses of the Victorian era, where, you know, there was a very charity oriented model, and those countries have moved far ahead in terms of independent living, in terms of community living, right? But we are still having a lot of kids, especially people with intellectual, psychosocial disabilities or complex needs, ending up in institutions. And sometimes parents say, well, we can't afford, we have to take care of the other kids, we simply cannot afford to care for this child. Or there is this, I would say, false sense that these institutions are safe, our children are vulnerable, we can't leave them at home, so they're better in an institution. But we don't know, because, you know, in terms of monitoring of institutions in our country, we still have a long way to go. And like, how can we even start talking about the rights of persons with disabilities when half of us are in institutions? How can we even start talking about inclusion when half of us are in institutions, right? So that deinstitutionalization, that investment in community-based care, community-based education, employment, right? Where that inclusive aspect is there, we really have a long way to go. But that said, like Lasanthe said, I think if we all have an idea of the broader social implications and the interlinkages, like you mentioned, between poverty, between gender, and all these other broader social issues, if we have that wider understanding, I really feel that we can make positive changes within our society. So actually, I want to thank all of you all for being fantastic allies. And I like it. Actually, it was Sonali who coined the term allyship today during this panel. And I think that is actually going to be one of the crucial things that can take us forward in order to respond to the needs of persons with disabilities, their families, in order to ensure lives of dignity and worth. You know, you are worth it at the end of the day. The constant message a lot of us with disabilities get is, you are bad, you are unworthy. But no, find that worthiness, use that worthiness to participate, to contribute, to shine, and live a life of dignity.
Thank you, Niluka. Thank you very much. And with that, we draw to a close this edition of Face the Nation. Throughout this discourse, we focused on the issues and the challenges that are faced by people living with disability, specifically in Sri Lanka, the need to overcome the stigma, the need to enable a culture of sensitization, to create awareness, not just within a ministry or within a few ministries or within a certain group of people, but within society. It's your problem, it's my problem, it's our issue to resolve. We also spoke about how we need an attitudinal shift in consciousness, in awareness, how we need a cultural shift, how we need to move from a culture of charity to one of empowerment, to one of dignity. So I'd like to thank our panel of guests for joining us for 2 hours tonight. Janit Rukmal, disability rights activist. Thank you, Janit, for your time, your perspectives. Niluka Gunawardana, disability researcher, educator, visiting lecturer, Calgary University. Thank you, Niluka, so much for your thoughts. Attorney at law, Lasanthi Daskon, visiting lecturer, Calgary and Colombo University. Thank you. And last but not least, Attorney at Law RMHP Gunaratna, member of the National Council for Persons with Disabilities. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our panel of journalists, Shehan, Deshan and Pavani, for joining tonight's discourse. Thank you very much for your time. This has been Reimagining Disability, mainstreaming the discourse. Thank you and good night.